So what's the deal with the firmware stuff? Because I occasionally will see articles about firmware situation improving with Nouveau, all of this stuff. What's actually the problem here, and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, so um, the big thing is that for whatever reason, NVIDIA came up with their signed firmware stuff to essentially um, lock down certain access to the hardware from the CPU side.
Hmm.
Um, for example, in Maxwell, we aren't able to control the fan speed of GPUs.
Okay.
Um, so even if we could reclock, if your fan is like still slow, it's kind of a problem.
Yeah, yeah. There's
Um,
only so much wiggle room you can really have there until it starts to overheat.
yeah, I mean the GPU has overheat protection, and
Sure,
at some point, like
but you don't
multiple
want to hit the
levels,
overheat
and
protection. That's the point I'm getting at.
well, that's fine to some degree because the first level of overheat protection is just throttling the clock
Mhm.
without cutting the voltage.
Right, but if you're
So you
overclocking,
already,
the point is sort of to raise the clock. That's the problem.
yeah, yeah, sure. But if you run at like 1/8 the frequency, you're still cutting the power consumption by
Right. Okay,
half.
that's fair. That's fair.
And yeah, and at some point, if it's like really getting hot, then this GPU just shuts off.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's not a great place, and you don't want to run the GPU constantly like
No.
this. Um, and then in later generations, they also like um, prevented us from even changing the voltage at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, yeah, no point in bothering anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and sadly, the firmware we were getting from NVIDIA was also like customly made for the Nouveau project,
Okay.
and they never gave us the firmware for power management, and only for context switching. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so yeah.
So you had firmware, but it was the most minimal of minimal firmware, basically.
Yes, it was enough to, drive displays and have multiple rendering contexts on the GPU.
Right. Right.
So, yeah.
So what's all this stuff that I'm hearing about the firmware situation getting better?
Yes. So the GSP firmware is basically a large chunk of their original driver moved to the GPU side into firmware.
Okay.
And it includes power management and display management and a lot of other stuff.
Mhm.
It's basically a lot of the driver just moves into the firmware, into the GPU. And the main advantage we have here is that we can use the exact same firmware NVIDIA is using in their driver.
Right.
Um, which helps us because we can basically do the same thing. And now that they also like open sourced their kernel driver,
Mm-hmm.
because if you move everything or a lot into the firmware, there are not really any secrets anymore. We can also like check out like how the driver interacts with the firmware and what we can do with the firmware and everything.
Mm-hmm. Because I remember when that kernel module came out, there was a lot of confusion about what it was, what it would actually do, like how, like there's. I'm certainly someone who doesn't have a deep understanding of the how Nvidia's graphic stack actually functions. So what was that kernel module, and what wasn't it is also very important.
Yeah, so the kernel module is more or less a layer for the user space driver to talk with the hardware.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the NVIDIA driver does a lot of stuff inside the kernel, like inside user space.
Mm-hmm.
And the kernel driver isn't really doing that much anymore. They also have something called user space command submission, which essentially means instead of telling the kernel you have commands for the GPU, they all do it inside user space.
Okay.
And they just need a kernel driver to wire up all the stuff and make sure there's no security implications of doing so and stuff like this. So basically just making GPU resources available to user space.
Okay.
It's a little bit different than the style we usually have with all the other DRM drivers inside Linux. So, but yeah, there is a huge benefit for using user space command submission because it helps with compute, because you can submit more stuff with lower CPU overhead. But yeah, the basic idea of the driver was just to have something open source, and in the past there was also like sometimes the GPL symbol situations coming up regularly.
What's this? I don't actually know this. What do you mean?
Oh, like sometimes NVIDIA wanted to use interfaces in the Linux driver, and then at some point people were like, "Oh yeah, but that's GPL only. You can't use this," and things like this happening. And so it's kind of from their perspective, it makes sense to have like an open source GPL driver, so they just don't have this problem anymore.
Okay, that makes sense. So, from the perspective of Nouveau, what would you want NVIDIA to actually do that would really help out the project? Because obviously, AMD's got this great open source driver that, every gamer uses that no one really worries about, and it's just fine. What would you want NVIDIA to do differently that would make this work out a lot smoother, at least hopefully?
Yeah, I think it will certainly help if they would dedicate more developers to the project, obviously. But I think their documentation approach could also be improving. It's I don't know if you saw it, but we have this like NVIDIA has this repository on GitHub with some documentation. Well, documentation. It's mostly just header files with names for registers. But yeah, they publish some stuff there. They document how to program the 3D engine or compute engine. And for example, in NVK, we only make use of that. So we don't really have to, reverse engineer certain commands anymore. So that's certainly helping. But there are like still gaps. And from time to time, we are still asking NVIDIA for more documentation. And sometimes they're responsive and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they forget to handle some requests for months or years. So